we have to, deal with. So why are there problems with self-reported data? Well, there's inherent problems with data entry in general, but also, some things just related to the sheer complexity of water rights. In general, these are some of the types of errors you might expect to find. Something like misentered data, which is genuinely just like a typo. We're all human, and Elon's neural link isn't really widespread yet. So fingers are still the preferred method of data transfer between us and machines, right? So typos happen. Also just, other types of mistakes or oversights, maybe inadvertently misreporting units of measurement or just using improper measurement techniques. There also can be unintentional misrepresentation of the diversion itself. That could be from, relatively poor understanding of the underlying water rights, or, complexities with reporting same diversions of use for multiple water rights that might cover that. Also, sometimes folks are just unaware of their responsibilities. And so things like failure to file a diversion and use report at all happens. So in addition to the user reported data, there's all sorts of other critical information that characterizes a water right. Some basic stuff like contact information, for example, is crucial for like reaching out to water right holders and get a better understanding of water diversion activities, perhaps even to check in on some of the very data quality issues we're talking about today. But as most water rights attached to the land, water rights can and they do change hands surprisingly frequently, and new owners are not always brought up to speed by the selling party or agent, and contact information isn't always updated either. Water right holders are not the only ones entering data incorrectly. We are also responsible for a substantial amount of data entry. Take, for example, when an initial statement of water diversion and use is submitted, these have previously been in paper format, staff have to interpret what is written down and manually enter that into the database. The varying ways of describing diversion facilities, or the different units, the different rates, volumes, you got meters, inches, cubic feet per second, gallons per minute, gallons per day, acre feet per year, and on, right? Well, this creates conditions that are ripe for misinterpretation or data entry mistakes. All right, so let's back up for a second here. What are we doing? We want to estimate water demand. Why, right? At its heart, any water availability analysis is essentially compares the supply of water to the demand of water at a specific location and point in time. So as such, accurate estimates of water demand are critical to make that analysis work. We saw some examples this morning's presentation where those numbers make a big difference. And look, there's more than one way to estimate that water demand. For example, hey, we've issued all these water rights, so don't we know how much water we've given out, right? That's commonly referred to as the paper water, because it's what's literally, the constraints, the maximum diversion amounts, maximum volumes, maximum, face value is commonly what that number is that sums up the total amount of water that could potentially be diverted or is authorized to be diverted for that water right. So we could just run with those numbers, but there's some problems, some really big problems related to just taking that paper number and moving forward with it. You got things like reservoir carryover. Permits for storage normally call out the total capacity of the reservoir. However, large reservoirs are generally not emptied and refilled every year, right? So the total face value represents far more water than is actually taken out of the stream in any given year. There's also stacked water rights. So stacked rights might include, several rights serving the same area with a combined limit that's maybe it's lower than the limits of all of the individual stacked rights added together, right? So just adding up all of the water rights that might be a component of that single diversion operation may not accurately represent what's actually allowed to be diverted. There's also things like unperfected water rights. there's state filings and other things that are there that could represent huge amounts of water that just historically have not actually been diverted yet. Also basic things like the seasonality of water rights. You could have two water rights on the same stream that might have different seasons of diversion they're allowed to divert. And so just adding up their annual face value isn't really representative of what might actually be happening to the stream at any given moment. There's also return flows, and not all of the water that's diverted is fully consumed, and some of that water runs off and kind of returns back to the system. And this water that returns, it can be used again and again, and we'll touch more on this later. All right, so paper water, maybe that's not the greatest way to go about it, but what about using new technology? There's a lot of new stuff out there that's really cool. Remote sensing in general, right? You could do aerial imagery. There's things like evapotranspiration, sophisticated techniques for directly measuring crop evapotranspiration, right? Can produce great estimates of actual water use, but there's still some limitations. We still need to have the actual place of use delineated to relate that back to an individual water right. What if there's like conjunctive uses, groundwater or contract water, other things that might be supplementing that? So look, it's great. It's great, really promising for the future, and we're still looking at using it in many ways, but we're not there yet, right? And so what other options are readily available? Well, we could base our estimates of water demand on the annual water use reports. Yes, it's self-reported data. Yes, it's susceptible to error and susceptible to misreporting, but it's here and we have used it before. So how bad can one bad record be? So let's look at this. This is a theoretical supply and demand chart. This was inspired by the Tuolumne River in 2015 during the last drought. And so we've got the blue line, which represents your supply flows. That's the actual water available for diversion that was flowing in the stream. This is going to look somewhat familiar to what we were looking at this morning. And then your orange line is your estimated demand, right? And this is just total demand. It's not delineated. It's not stratified by water rights or anything like that, but we're just looking at the total demand in this watershed. So, okay, so this is the same one, but instead of using units of, time average cubic feet per second, this is the same exact chart. I just converted to acre feet, just for the sake of the visualization here. So what happens when we add just one small domestic registration, let's say a 10 acre foot face value, who mistakenly reported their gallons in units of acre feet? Well, there are 325,851 gallons in just 1 acre foot. So that puts us at 3.26 million acre feet per year, or say divided by 12, let's go 271,000 acre feet per month. So what does that do if we add that to the entire Tuolumne River basin? All right, so the red line is now our new demand. And I left the old one in orange, and there's our supply flows. So we call these the model busters, because when you're trying to use models to numerically solve for water allocations, demand data with even one of these bad boys in there makes the whole analysis kind of fall on its face. Some of these are easy to catch, like post-1914 appropriatives with known constraints on that maximum authorized diversion. Sure, we can catch those fairly easily. Others are, not so much, like many statements of water diversion and use. So I grew up on a small rural ranch in a town called Nicholas. Some of you may have heard of it, most probably not. We had walnuts. Let's say we have a fictitious rural water right holder. We'll call him Sam's Ranch, right? And maybe he has some large water rights serving his irrigation needs, but he may be claiming riparian use from a small spring or something for his domestic purposes, which happen to be measured in gallons, as most domestic use is. So from our perspective here in Sacramento, that can be tricky to tease out whether the volume of water being reported for that statement is legitimate or not. The moral of the story is that each and every single water right can play a role in how the analysis settles out, and the numbers matter. All right. So last checked, there's about 460,082 reports and over 9.4 million individual records of diversion and use data submitted to the division. That's a lot for a limited number of people to look at. So in general, we like to automate as much as possible. Some corrections can be automated as well. Those are kind of more like proposed corrections that require technical staff to kind of sign off on them, so to speak. But others may require substantial investment of time and resources to vet and clean. So as some of you may be familiar with, some of the data, a lot of this data is available to the public, but it can be relatively limited, at least in bulk format. But fortunately, internally here at the division, we get dibs on the flat files, so they're called. So these are curated data sets that were pulled from the underlying ERIMS and RMS databases, which those are, they're far too complex for me or my staff to query directly. Now, the flat files are not ERIMS, but they were created from clever querying of those underlying ERIMS databases. The vast majority of information leading to the application, permitting, inspection, and perfection of all water rights they still live in the paper water right files, which are stashed away in the vault on the second floor of the Cal EPA building in Sacramento. Yes, efforts to digitize data have taken place in the past. And yeah, more will happen in the future, but we're not there yet. That's simply a limitation we're faced with at this time. So for now, we're working with what we can access that's electronic. The flat files are large. Some are too big to be accessed by traditional means, such as Microsoft Excel, which is limited to just over 1 million rows, or even a Microsoft Access database, which is limited to 2 gigs for any single database or table, right? So a scripting language like Python or R is needed simply to access the data, but it also provides huge advantages in ensuring transparency, reproducibility, and the ability to be shared and understood by anyone that has a basic understanding of that language. And I'm sure that will be appreciated by anyone that has spent large time with complex spreadsheets with a mixture of in-cell formulas mixed with VBA macros and routines. Look, I still love my Excel, but there's definitely a time and a place for it in today's data-rich world. The scripts that staff put together will be made available via GitHub, along with some basic documentation describing how the scripts should be run and how the source data and repositories should be set up. So they kind of break down into 2 different categories. So first, the cleverly named Python script 1 essentially grabs the flat files, processes and aggregates the data as needed, performs some pre-processing like pre-calculated fields, say for total annual use or averages. It can unstack those monthly values. It essentially collects and grooms those flat files to hand off to the flag scripts. All right, so now what we're going to do is walk through every line of code. No, I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. You can do that if you'd like. We're going to share the GitHub link, but this is just kind of a reference here of what I'm talking about. What is a Python script, right? Well, here it is. It's literally a script of code that kind of walks through line by line and says, hey, this is where I'm going to grab data. This is where I found the data. I'm pulling it in. I'm going to do this to it. Then I'm going to do that. It kind of walks you through exactly what is happening to that data. The second script starts using logical functions to assess the actual water rights data, kind of field by field or record by record, and it automates the flagging of suspected errors for us. The outputs can be in raw CSV files, but they'll ultimately live in some type of a relational database, like Microsoft Access, because the output CSVs alone may not provide enough information or kind of context to begin assessing that flag data on its own. Through the use of primary keys, additional useful fields can be related back to other tables to produce helpful reports through custom querying of that data. And here's just a snippet of some of the code from Python script 2. Okay, so what are the types of things that we're flagging data for? The scripts we developed to identify, they identify specific data fields from the flat files, and they perform logical tests, sometimes based on predefined thresholds, to flag individual records. Now, these could be individual reports for a specific water right, or perhaps the flag applies generally to a water right, or even a water right holder. I mentioned thresholds, and these can be modified or calibrated over time, and the scripts themselves can be adjusted as well. I mean, we did our best to kind of sit around the table and discuss in forethought, like what types of scenarios we might run into. But like I said, I mean, this is all happening in very real time. And so some of our reviews they've been preliminary so far. We haven't been able to take as deep a dive into all of the results as we'd like, but we're excited to do that. It's fully anticipated that this will be a bit of an iterative process of refining kind of what we're looking for in the data and how we find it. But in general, the data flags fall into one of 4 categories. We're going to start digging into, first I'm going to talk about the excessive reported diversion category. But there's the duplicate reporting, missing data, and water availability data. So the excessive reported diversion category contains 5 flags that identify water rights with reported diversion and use values that either exceed the water rights face value, or they're otherwise unreasonable diversion and use amounts. Reports flagged under this category tend to account for the most egregious of bad data. Remember that simple oversight on units can result in 325,000 times the actual quantity of water diverted. So here's an example, right? We'll call it Sam's Ranch. Solely responsible for over 7.7 million acre feet of water in 2019 alone. You can see the little conversion there. Their face value is actually 72.4, but they're probably trying to report 23.7 acre feet, which is the conversion from gallons to acre feet. But unfortunately, the units were in units of acre feet. So other unit conversions could happen as well. But sometimes it's difficult to kind of nail down whether it's indeed a unit conversion because they may not be reporting their full face value amount. And so the number can seem a bit arbitrary. Either way, it's definitely easier to identify those post-1914 water rights than it is for statements. Unfortunately, one of the best ways we've identified for assessing those statements is kind of literally by, sorting by the largest reported diversions and just kind of letting let's say the bad data float to the top. I'm sure some of you are on wastewater, so you know what I'm talking about. We've started generating a list of diverters, basically, of who could reasonably divert such large quantities. Mostly there's going to be cities, municipalities, large irrigation districts, things of that nature. And then we kind of let those other ones kind of float off the list. And so those ones that don't really meet the list, maybe they're changed to 0 or otherwise adjusted accordingly based on available information, but also just kind of the time that we have. So diversion reported outside of the season of diversion. Why is this a problem? If we include this in our analysis, we may be taking water off the table during dry parts of the year when this water might not have even had a valid water right to actually pull that water out. And also, I'd like to point out on this slide, we have a logic tree on the right-hand side. These trees, for the most part, have been developed for each and every flag, and they were the blueprints for coding the scripts in Python. They attempt to kind of clearly define which flat files are required, which fields from those flat files are required, and any new fields that should be a part of the flag output. And it also goes into the basic logic behind the calculation of the flag outputs. And I won't be showing all of these today, but they will be made available as part of the documentation. All right, so diversion exceeds face value or initial reported diversion. This one's very similar to the unit conversion issue, just kind of with a different set of thresholds. Excessive diversion and use amounts reported for irrigation. This one tries to identify water rights that may be reporting in excessive amounts based on kind of calculation of that irrigation duty when that information is available. But keywords when the information is available. This is unfortunately a set of information that's kind of plagued with those inconsistent, incomplete, and unusable woes that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. But hey, when the data is there, we try to use it. Also, diversion and use statistics. So this is just kind of a more classic statistical approach of identifying outliers, attempting to identify outliers in the reported history. The problem is, even though we have a lot of data, each water right may only have up to like about 10 years of individual reports, maybe less, which is a very small population size to apply most statistical analysis. But it is an attempt to provide an additional angle, ideally cross-validating other flags, and resulting in overall more concrete identification of those error records. Okay, duplicate reporting. Duplicate reporting category includes 4 flags that identify water rights with reports that contain duplicate diversion and use values for several types of scenarios. Errant reports that are properly flagged under this category, if they're not removed from the record or otherwise corrected, they can artificially inflate that estimated demand as a result of inadvertently double reporting the same water. Duplicate reporting for multiple water rights by the same owner. So look, water rights get complicated, right? Some diverters have many water rights, and some of those water rights serve the same place of use or can even draw from the same point of diversion. But in reality, right, that may not be how the diversion facility is measured or even operated. Proper accounting of these water rights can be difficult, and it is tempting to simply report like the total applied water amount under each water right, like the total combined amount, and just kind of drop that into each water right and send it off, just kind of get it off your plate. Look, I get it, but trust me, like we don't know how your diversions are managed any better than you do. And inflation of the actual demand could mean that less water is on the table for everyone in the watershed during times of shortage or drought. So we want to be cautious of that. Duplicate points of diversion. This identifies when there are multiple water rights with the same point of diversion. So same point of diversion for the same water right. This can happen, for instance, when a statement is initially filed to meet the reporting requirements, but maybe it doesn't satisfy the required underlying basis of right for the diversion. And so later an appropriative right might be filed, but that statement was never canceled. And there's various flavors of how this type of thing can happen. They also tend to apply to some regions more than others, particularly where there have been large enforcement sweeps. It results in the same thing, double counting of water that from our side gets pulled out twice, but in reality was only pulled out once. This is another example of just kind of a more basic, simpler logic tree for that. Okay, duplicate diversion and use values reported for multiple months or years. This is basically flagging records where the diverter is saying the same thing all the time, right? There may be genuine cases where reported diversions really are kind of dead flat. For example, in those stacked rights that I was talking about, where maybe there's one that's more senior, and so diversions are typically fully allotted to the most junior water right, and then it goes on to the next junior one and next junior and so on. So it can result in what appears to be flatline amounts. But typically actual diversion patterns vary from month to month and from year to year based on actual available water supply and the application of water for beneficial use purposes. This is where having the related water rights, looking at other flags, maybe some research and experience and just intuition by technical staff who are reviewing these records is where this all kind of comes into play. Duplicate storage and use values. So this one identifies water rights when they report the same amount for storage as the same amount for use during the same month for the whole year. Generally, the purpose of seasonal storage is to offset the time of primary beneficial use of that water from the time of the diversion of water, right? Reports with identical patterns of storage or use, particularly when there's no direct diversion component, could potentially be either inaccurately reporting the timing and magnitude of those diversions, or it indicates a general lack of understanding of the water right. It's difficult to recommend a specific corrective action, but depending on the number of water rights and the magnitude and timing of those water diversions, it may impact the results of a water availability analysis. So keeping track of how many cases where this may be happening might become more important. Now, again, this is water rights, right? So there's always certainly cases when this may be an acceptable, totally reasonable way to report. For example, if a reservoir has been repurposed purely for fish and wildlife enhancement purposes, perhaps just having the water there is the actual use. Missing data. All right, so there's 3 flags that identify and analyze water rights with missing information or missing annual reports. So I kind of touched on the missing contact info earlier, but let's talk about missing reports. When diversion and use information is not reported to the division must assume that the maximum authorized amount is being diverted, which may artificially inflate projections of demand, as I talked about earlier with that whole paper water issue. If it is determined that there's not enough water supply available to meet all the demand in a watershed, junior water rights may be impacted by curtailment or there may be other required water use reductions that are all based on the information, on the assumptions that we need to make because the reporting data wasn't submitted. The way that we have recommended dealing with this issue of missing reports is by apportioning the face value amount, so the total amount, to the months that are authorized under the season diversion for that water right, and just kind of flatly distributing it. We considered developing other monthly patterns of diversion based on, for example, beneficial use types or other ways of binning it, and those approaches have been done before, but it was determined to be kind of like a little bit too regional in nature and difficult to be accurately applied across the entire state. So while the equal monthly distribution is an oversimplification, it's still light years ahead of using 0, which is what was reported, or taking that full face value amount and just dividing it by 12 months across the board without care for whether diversions may actually be authorized to be happening during those months that it's added to. It would be great to have full compliance so that we could avoid making assumptions about water diversion and use, which, like I said, could potentially impact other water rights. All right, so the water availability data category contains 4 flags that use the existing water rights data in ERIMs and also in the use reports to better curate estimated water demand data sets for performing the actual water availability analysis or for other demand analysis. These will assist in determining allocation of shortages based on the water rights priority system when projected supply flows are insufficient to meet projected demand. So assigning priority dates. Unfortunately, the inconsistent, incomplete, and unusable description of data problems does indeed apply to the most basic of water rights data, a priority date, which is paramount in determining water availability under a priority-based regime. The priority date field is unfortunately not consistently populated for post-1914 appropriative rights, and it's far worse for statements including pre-1914. To add to the complexity, it's not uncommon for one initial statement of water diversion use to claim both riparian and pre-14, while also providing no information on when that pre-14 diversion may have been originally established. We, as a division, are very limited in our scope and ability to verify or confirm pre-1914 and riparian basis of right. And also, let me be clear, it's not that we don't know the priority dates for post-1914 water rights, but more that where that information is stored in our database is either inconsistent or has errors. For example, we found a water right with a priority date in the year 8000. This little guy actually broke our script, which is how we found it, and that took some time to isolate and fix. This isn't a very common issue, but those dates can live in various places in our databases, and so this script has a consistent predefined way that it goes through, finds those dates, and assess and picks which one to use. So accounting for water returned back to the system. Return flow is kind of a complex and like maybe somewhat nebulous, but vital component of California's water rights system, surface water rights system. Let's say you divert from a stream and use that water to irrigate your fields, and some of it, say 10% of it, runs off and flows back into the river. It's now in fact available for diversion by downstream water rights, even though it was already diverted by someone else. Now, if you scale that up and then assume that there might be a lot of other water rights that are having the same situation happening, there can be a significant portion of water that is used and reused again over and over again. Interestingly, the source of the return flow is not related to when that water was diverted, but rather when it was used. And the percent of that return flow is based on the type of beneficial use it might be. So for example, some domestic use may result in 0% return. It's literally being fully consumed. Whereas power generation might result in 100% of the water being returned, or fully no consumption happening, fully non-consumptive. So this script kind of curates that return flow data so that it can be properly considered in a water availability analysis by adding that return flow water back as a new source of water. We drew some inspiration from the 1977 drought effort, particularly the idea that return flow can vary by month and by use type. But look, the key takeaway here is when you report your use and when you report your diversion to storage and the amount of time in between that, it matters, right? That's kind of the moral. Primary beneficial uses. Many water rights have multiple uses. Characterizing them as having only one primary beneficial use can be helpful for a variety of reasons, but care must be taken to assess which use takes priority over the others. And this script does just that. It prioritizes which beneficial use should be selected under various combinations of other beneficial uses. There's also a special subscript that identifies combined irrigation plus municipal. And there also is a case where it could be irrigation plus domestic for some older municipal rights. But it's so that those are not characterized as purely irrigation or purely municipal, but as both, as they can often kind of share relatively equal quantities of that total demand. Multiple points of diversion in different watersheds. So this goes through and identifies when there's one water right that may have many points of diversions that span across watersheds. This can and it does happen for larger water rights. And unfortunately, the reported water use is not split up by POD or by beneficial use. But as such, typically one point of diversion is used to kind of characterize a water right. And so we've flagged these records so that proper care and accounting can be taken into effect when assessing the supply and demand across those watersheds. All right, so there's a lot of reports and there's a lot of flags to assess with limited staff resources. So where do we start? Well, we need a way to kind of scale down the scope of the data correction to an area of interest, like a watershed. It's also kind of convenient to, you commonly find trends of like types of diversion uses, maybe the quantities and season of diversion that kind of take place throughout an individual watershed. And that kind of helps build some familiarity and a sense of intuition as to what should be expected and not expected to be found by staff who are reviewing that data, which kind of speeds up the data flag review. So, there's often existing priority watersheds. For example, we have depicted here a map of the cannabis priority watersheds. As I mentioned, I'm from the cannabis section. But general assessment of the types and extent of flags that might happen in each watershed, these two considerations, the existing priorities and look at what the data is telling us about what the extent of error is, and kind of use those two considerations together to inform our decision on where to start. So once you have your kind of area defined, you're going to start going through, you're going to first assess the extent and the type of flags. We have some pre-built data visualizations that are helpful. You just kind of connect the new data source to it. And this helps assess like large amounts of data visually rather than like kind of line by line. But in general, the process is, first confirm whether the flagged records represent an actual reporting or data entry error. And then perform some sort of corrective action for those confirmed errant records. And then make sure you memorialize that corrective action. Why do we want to memorialize it? Well, first, we want to reduce duplication of efforts. We don't want to be looking at the same data over and over again. But it also helps build a defensible foundation for predicting that water demand. But it also increases transparency and reproducibility, right? And more importantly, it also allows for improvement over time. Improving the data, both our scripts and how we identify bad data, but the whole thing, collecting accurate data up front is better than correcting the bad data on the back, right? And so one of the things that we can use this information for is kind of for like a feedback loop where we can facilitate targeted and prioritized outreach to stakeholders to correct some of those most egregious reporting errors at the source, right? So that the bad data and the assumptions that we have to make that go along with it, so that those can be minimized over time as that underlying reported data set becomes more and more accurate. But it can also inform how we can become better at collecting the data in the first place. We can ask better questions or provide more clarity. In fact, there already have been some recent improvements to the reporting system. And this kind of helps streamline certain aspects of it to reduce, with the goal of reducing error based on feedback and seeing some of the results. So this included simplified reporting for most diverters with water rights that are 10 acre feet or less. So the relatively smaller water rights. And right there, it allows you to kind of toggle views between units of acre feet and gallons, right? That alone can kind of hopefully stem a lot of these issues from happening. It also had some other improvements and clarifications because there's a lot of other questions that get asked on the reports than just the actual numbers. And so it kind of helps clarify that for folks. Okay. All right, so additional considerations. There's other things, right, that we'd love to include that we haven't included this time. There's other complexities in the data that probably need to be fully considered before you can come up with a very accurate analysis in some watersheds. Things like contract water and exchange contracts or water transfers can all have a meaningful impact on what's actually happening with water in the watershed that may or may not be directly reflected in the reported record. So there's a little bit more digging that might need to happen in some of those more complex watersheds. There's also things like adjudications, which can have similar impacts. and even board decisions and orders, which can kind of maybe override the rules of traditional water rights in some cases. And there's all kinds of other complex issues that may need evaluation on kind of a more, individual basis. So we fully acknowledge that up front. Okay, so first we sourced our data, we determined the best way to standardize that data assessment, and we applied corrective actions. And now we have a more accurate historical record of diversion and use. So now what do we do with that, right? Well, we can use that data to generate predictions on things like current or future predicted use, like perhaps what might happen over the next 6 months during this drought. These are important questions, and to be able to answer them accurately and as timely as possible is preferred. Also, remember that reporting is on a monthly time interval for the reports that I'm talking about, which is far better than annual. But the reality is that diversions are not a constant monthly time average slow draw on the stream system. They can happen sporadically or intermittently across that month, sometimes at the same time as other diversions and sometimes not. We can use basic assumptions or even more sophisticated techniques, even artificial intelligence and machine learning, to maybe better predict some of those sub-monthly temporal resolutions of diversion patterns, but we're not quite there yet. Managing to the month is perhaps not ideal for all use cases, like, for example, assessing ecologic in-stream flow needs. But it's the data that's available to us at this time, and it's far better than annual. And it's still a good metric for determining total watershed available at a seasonal time scale. But what do we mean by like management scenarios? Predicting these management scenarios. Well, we can kind of use the historical record to generate these multiple projected water demand scenarios that can later be, evaluated and used for management of water resources. For example, an average diversion scenario, like taking that record and just taking an average, maybe that's a good metric for modeling purposes in the development and implementation of flow requirements, or for managing real-time water availability. While maybe an aggressive scenario based on paper demands might be useful more for like a water availability analysis when you're issuing new permits. You want to be relatively confident that water is available in most years. Or you might even want to produce like a more conservative scenario that underestimates demand that may be better suited for your case. Tabulating those results of multiple scenarios simultaneously can also put some bookends on that analysis, so you can run multiple scenarios and kind of projecting a range of potential water availability scenarios for better consideration of the overall picture, regardless of which specific scenario may ultimately be developed. This early and transparent coordination and communication between the division and stakeholders will ultimately lead to a transparent, consistent baseline from which any water rights demand-based numeric analysis can begin. We're hoping for increased buy-in from the public and stakeholders on water resource management decisions that we ultimately make. Good quality water diversion and use data will ultimately help the state, maximize that beneficial use of water and uphold the water rights priority system as efficient, equitable, and timely as possible. So I just wanted to briefly touch on Senate Bill 88, which many of you are probably familiar with, is the increased requirements for water diversion measurement and reporting. This will improve accuracy and frequency of measurement, which will result in that improved temporal resolution, that sub-monthly resolution I was talking about. Hopefully will allow division to devote less time to data cleanup activities. And it's already proven to be highly valuable to the division when the data is available, particularly in kind of case-by-case analysis scenarios. Unfortunately, there's not enough compliance at this point. It's about 20%, which kind of prevents us from fully utilizing it in these broader predictions of water demand. But we're looking forward to integrating this potentially a highly valuable data set into future projections. So, so how to get access to the scripts and the data. So we're planning to release this in a few weeks, and you can sign up through the Drought Lyris, and you cannot contact us through this email inbox because it hasn't actually been created yet. And that part was supposed to be taken off. My apologies. So anyways, keep an eye out. We will be releasing this in a few weeks. That's the documentation and the scripts. And that wraps it up, folks. Again, thank you for your time today. And we really appreciate you being willing to kind of, take time out of your day and engage with us. Thanks again.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dan Schultz with the Division of Water Rights, and I oversee the cannabis section, and Sam and his team. So one clarification on that Drought email address, there was some complications on it that we had, but it should be up and running by the end of the day or over the weekend, first thing next week. So you can go ahead and contact us through that, probably starting early next week. I'm going to go ahead and facilitate the question and answer period here. So we've got a couple questions in chat at this point. Of course, go ahead and feel free to put any questions you have into chat and we can respond to them there. If you are having problems with chat or anything else, then you can go ahead and raise your hand and we'll go ahead and call on you. So the first question is from Darren, and this question is related to how the flag for, I believe it was the, I didn't see when it specifically came in, but how we look at multiple PODs within a given distance. And it is, does that mean that we are going to reference all PODs within half a kilometer of each other as duplicate?
That's a great question. And no, what it means is that that those records may get flagged for review, and so they may get flagged as having that falling under that flag, right? And this is where that review process comes in and kind of looking, well, how do all the other flags come together, to try to identify, that could represent a duplicate report, right? But it may not. And again, this is also a threshold number that we haven't completely dialed in and calibrated. You poked around, initially and seeing what it might result in. But those are the kinds of things we intend may become a little bit more calibrated over time. Good question.
Okay, the second question is, which I think we addressed because this came in right before we flipped to the SB88 slide. Larger diverters are now required to provide real-time diversion data through a public website. Are those data being used by division staff for demand data assessments in addition to the annually reported diversions and use data? And I think we addressed that through that slide. This was from Bram Circu. If you have additional questions to that, why don't you go ahead and maybe elaborate if there's a more specific question you have on that one. Okay, and a question from Todd Schroeder, and this is SB88 also requires the annual reports to provide monthly reporting by POD, or how has that data been analyzed? And for this effort right now, I'll go ahead and take this one. We're really focused not so much on the data that's been reported through the SB88 at this point. What we're really looking at is the user supported or user reported data that is in general in our in the RMS database. So we've kind of carved out SB88 a little bit on the side for additional analysis, kind of separately from this aspect. And I don't know if you have anything you want to elaborate on with that, Sam.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, next question is, when will we have the recordings available? I missed the morning session. I was late to this one. It usually takes us a week or so to get these up. So what we'll go ahead and do is, if everybody who's interested can go ahead and, what we'd like to do is to have everybody sign up for the Drought LIRIS email list, because that will be our primary way that we'll be communicating with stakeholders moving forward. And when we get the videos posted on the website, we'll send out a LIRIS email to let you know that they're available. Next question is from Greg Reese. How much metadata will be available? For example, which flags resulted in a change in data, or if staff identified errors were corrected, will the reasons be displayed?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And let me, so this, remember when I said, we're trying to engage early and often here, these procedures are very new. And so we haven't actually started applying this to live demand data yet, other than through testing. We are planning to roll straight out of this into applying it to actual watersheds, and that the data that we develop from those are intended to be used in this drought year. But the corrections, there's not a large set of corrective actions or anything. None of that has actually been done yet to share. So what will be shared is the actual scripts that are, and the documentation that explains how we're basically planning to process and correct that data. It's a good question.
All right, so the next question is, up to which year have you done your water demand assessment? And for this question, we've just developed the flags at this point, kind of the scripts to identify how we will go about identifying data that might have issues. We haven't started to apply it yet. We do plan to, moving forward, do a couple pilot projects to kind of work through this, as well as we get feedback from public stakeholders, from you all, on anything you see with the scripts and stuff, to update those over time and start to work through some of the demand assessment. And then there's a question from Kirk about posting the link to the LIRIS email in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and, oh, looks like Shay, I think already got it in there. You can either go directly to the Drought email there, or if you go to the Drought website, which is, we'll put in as well in the chat, waterboards.ca.gov/drought. In the bottom left-hand corner of that webpage, you can sign up for the LIRIS email list there. And then a question from Leo: what is the process of data correction when they misreport it? So I can probably go ahead and cover that if you want, Sam. Where we're at right now is we've got to the point of trying to develop the process of how to flag the data for potential errors. The second half of this process will be looking at how do we document or how do we review and assess those flags to see what needs to be corrected with the data, and try to document some procedures for doing that, as well as memorializing those changes through potential updates to the ERIMS database, so that in the future, when that data gets pulled, decisions that were made by staff when cleaning the data will be continued moving forward. As far as looking at moving forward with new data being submitted, the idea is that we could run the scripts to identify potential errors in data, and immediately circle back and reach out to diverters, or to reporters and diverters that submitted that data, to check their data to see if it was reported accurately or if there was potentially errors. And then next question, and I'll let you take this one, Sam, is place of use associated with each reported water use?
Yeah, place of use is a very critical piece of information regarding any water right. The point of diversion, which is where you pull the water out, right? It may not always be necessarily even near where the authorized use is allowed to take place, which is the place of use. Unfortunately, that place of use information, for the most part, has not been digitized and is not available on a broad scale electronically. That information is available. It basically lives in the paper water right files and requires a decent amount of effort to identify specifically where the POUs are. So that's certainly something on the board's wish list for the future, to get that access to that information electronically and in large scale. But we're just not there yet, unfortunately.
Okay, next question is from Will Anderson, and it is, are there any plans to change the submittal method of higher resolution measurement data through SB88 or telemetry? Currently, submittals are attachments to RMS annual reports and an online website. Are there anticipated revisions of the regulations? For us and our staff, we don't directly oversee the SB88 component. We're just kind of looking at kind of a little bit more of a narrow view. And as I mentioned earlier, we're kind of excluding a lot of the SB88 data from part of this analysis at this time. We will look to incorporate any data associated with SB88. So I don't actually have a comment on that one, but if you want to send myself or Sam an email, we can certainly pass that on to the SB88 team for a response on that one. Let's see, we have a question here from Mark Van Camp, and it looks like it's primarily looking at any idea on schedule, and also can you please provide support to the 20% of the SB88 compliance number? Large water diverters in the Sac Valley measure due to contracts and represent a very significant amount of water. I expect much more than 20%. So with this one from a timeline perspective, I'll let Sam answer from the perspective of the 20% of the SB88 compliance. That's looking statewide of just how many stakeholders that are potentially subject to SB88 have provided the information to the water board. It's not looking at volume of water. It's just looking at a count of potential diverters that should be responding and whether or not we've received a response, in the submittal of data. And Sam, timeline-wise, I don't know if you have kind of a general timeline in your head on this one, or if you'd like me to take that one.
And you're talking timeline on SB88?
No, I think the question is a little bit more our general schedule for the project and for the data cleanup.
Sure. So, we're looking to try to. There's still some work going on right now on this project, and we're hoping to wrap that up within the next couple weeks, so that we can actually dig in, like I said, to a pilot watershed and start applying this, and hopefully that information, that direct experience, will help refine some of the scripts. So this will be happening in real time over the course of the summer. Well, over the course of the next few month or so. It's going to have to happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I would add, I think what we'll be looking at is we hope to have the supporting documentation and the scripts made available to everybody in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And once that we make that available, we'll probably be looking at about a 30-day comment period to review those scripts and provide us feedback, so we can start to incorporate that in our procedures and guidelines moving forward. We'll also be, as I mentioned, doing some pilot studies, which will probably refine some of those scripts and as we move forward, we'll start to develop the procedures and guidelines as well for more of the analysis, documentation, and memorialization of fixing the data, the historic data that's been submitted. And so it's kind of a little bit of a moving target because it's a product that's under development, and we're, in my mind, we're sharing it kind of pre-draft form, just to make sure that we get early comment and review from stakeholders to make sure we're on the right track. So we'll probably have a few more check-ins as we move through this process moving forward. And the next question is, where can we report data errors when we use these data and find some errors? That's a great question, and something that I think we'll have to set up. It's not currently set up at this point. So we haven't really got to the point of really applying it yet. We're just at this point really just sharing where we're at with the scripts we developed, and as I mentioned, as you start to apply them, what we're looking for at this point is feedback on whether or not they're basically behaving as expected. Do you see the scripts identifying data that shouldn't be identified? Is there bad data that is not being identified by the scripts, or so on and so forth? And also kind of some conceptual feedback on thresholds. When Sam was talking a little bit about, you have people reporting above their face value amount. What's a reasonable amount for someone to report above their face value amount? We can easily flag if it's just a yes, no answer, but when we really look to start using the data, is 25% reasonable? Someone that reports 25% above face value, is that a legitimate number, or is that an error? And how do we kind of navigate some of those threshold decisions as well? So for those type feedback and those comments, we'll have our Drought email that you can respond to, and when we send out the LIRIS, as well as put the procedures and guidelines on the website for review, as well as the scripts on GitHub, we'll make sure it'll probably be the Drought email inbox as well that we would be requesting comments and questions to be sent to, but we'll make sure to clarify that. It looks like that brings us to the end of the questions currently in the chat. Are there any additional questions at this time? I am seeing none. If you have any questions that come up, please reach out to us through the Drought email. We'd love to hear any feedback that you might have. And thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you to Sam and his team for all the hard work on this. It's been a bit of a, as I like to call it, an onion, where as we moved through this project, it seemed pretty straightforward at the beginning, and through every step, there was another layer and another layer and another layer that had to be peeled off to try to figure out how to solve a lot of these scripts and decisions that have been made. So really want to send out a big thanks to the staff who worked very hard on getting us to this point. So
and Dan, I'd also like to acknowledge, Shay Richardson kind of took the lead towards the end and really pulled this project through. So thank you for that. Also, my other staff, Darren Jojo has been heavily involved. He's been pretty much the one doing all the coding, huge lift. So thank you for doing that. And Mitt and John have been putting in a lot of work as well. But I also wanted to just call out, we do have, looks like we've got Will Anderson and Jeff Sanchez in the audience here, both of which who were heavily involved in the development of this project as well when they were at the board. And so thank you guys. And it's cool to see you here.
All right, I don't see any other questions coming in, so that will conclude our meeting. Thank you, everybody.